Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. True Crime for Sleep and your guide into the darkest corners of the world, where shadows whisper and silence screams. Are you prepared to embrace the dark? If you're drawn to the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries, join our circle. Subscribe and enable all notifications. I am with you and our lullaby starts right now. May 2023. Kalamazoo, Michigan. A remodeling crew thought they were working on plumbing. That's how these stories always begin, with something ordinary. A farmhouse built in the late 1800s, weathered siding, crooked porch rails, a place that looked like it had survived too many winters and too many owners, the kind of house people buy because it feels historic, the kind with charm. The crew had already stripped wallpaper from 3 rooms. They pulled up warped oak flooring in the hallway. Dust coated the air. Old insulation clung to their gloves. Then someone noticed it. A seam in the pantry floor. Not a crack. A seam. Perfectly rectangular. It was too precise to be wrought. They tapped it. Hollow. They pried it open slowly, expecting maybe a root cellar or old storage space. What they found instead was a wooden ladder descending into darkness. No smell of damp soil. No cold draft. Just still air. One of the workers climbed down first, phone flashlight cutting through the black. And then he stopped moving. "Guys," he said quietly. Below them wasn't a cellar. It was a bedroom. Preserved. Frozen in time. 1970s wallpaper yellow with faded daisies. A twin bed made neatly with a pastel quilt. A small dresser. Plastic hair clips scattered near a mirror. Children's books stacked beside the bed. And on the carpet near the corner. Teeth. Small human baby teeth. That was the moment the job stopped being renovation and became excavation. Police were called. Within hours, the farmhouse was sealed off. By the end of the week, it was the center of a statewide investigation. Because the house had history. And that history had a name. Harland. The Harland family bought the farmhouse in 1968. Walter Harland, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children. Gregory, Sarah, and the youngest, Rosie. In 1981, 9-year-old Rosie Harland was reported missing. The official record says probable runaway. 9 years old. Runaway. No Amber Alert system existed then. No national media push. A short newspaper column. A few neighbors questioned. The case faded. But now, more than 40 years later, a hidden room had been found beneath the pantry floor. And it was clearly designed for a child. Investigators descended carefully. They photographed everything before touching it. The room had electricity once. Old wiring ran through the ceiling beams. A small bulb hung above the bed. But there were no windows. No visible external ventilation. The walls were thick. Soundproofed. Someone had built this intentionally. The wallpaper dated late 1970s. The books were printed between 1976 and 1980. A diary was found in the dresser drawer. Most pages were torn out. The remaining entries were written in careful, rounded handwriting. Sarah says, "I'm not allowed upstairs today. Daddy says I'm sick. I can hear Lily crying." Lily. There was no Lily Harland listed in public records. The teeth found on the floor were sent to forensic analysis immediately. Dental examination confirmed they belonged to a child between the ages of 7 and 10. There were 5 teeth in total. Naturally shed, possibly. Extracted, also possible. The distinction would matter. As investigators dug deeper into public records, another detail emerged. Between 1975 and 1992, the Harland home had been registered intermittently as a foster placement address. At least 7 children had passed through the home under temporary state custody. Of those 7, 2 had incomplete records. 1 listed as relocated. 1 marked medical complication. But no hospital files could be found. The deeper detectives went, the more irregularities appeared. Caseworker signatures that no longer matched employment logs. Missing visitation reports. Gaps in documentation that seemed too consistent to be accidental. The farmhouse was processed for days. Underneath the twin bed, investigators found something else. A dollhouse, old wooden hand-painted. It was detailed with miniature furniture, but the front panel had something carved into it. 7 sets of initials: RH, ES, LB, MT, CD, JR, AK, Rosie Harland. The others were not family members. Detectives began cross-referencing foster placement records. Emily Stanton, placed in 1978, reported as returned to biological relatives, no forwarding address. Lily Beck, found wandering in woods in 1992, age approximately 14, suffering trauma-induced amnesia, identity never confirmed. The name Lily Beck appeared in missing persons archives. Found disoriented, dehydrated, unable to recall her last name. Placed into temporary care. Later adopted under sealed records. At the time, authorities believed she had wandered away from an unstable home. Now standing inside a secret underground bedroom, the possibility shifted. What if Lily had escaped? The ladder leading into the room showed where patterns. Not from decades of use. From repeated climbing. The hidden door above was reinforced from the outside. A locking mechanism had been installed underneath the pantry floorboards. Whoever was inside that room did not control the exit. Forensic team found scratch marks on the interior side of the wooden ladder frame. Tiny layered marks. Repeated attempts to climb. The diary fragments were sent to handwriting analysis. The writing matched school records from Rosie Harland's elementary assignments. Which meant one thing. Rosie had not run away. She had been down there, under her own house, in a room no one was supposed to know existed. The question was why, and who built it. Property renovation records from 1974 showed an unpermitted foundation reinforcement. Signed off privately. Contractor listed Gregory Harland, Rosie's older brother. At the time, Gregory was 19. When contacted by investigators in 2023, he lived 2 counties away. He had never left Michigan. He agreed to speak voluntarily. During the initial interview, Gregory appeared cooperative, calm, almost relieved. He admitted he had helped build the room, but he said it wasn't what police thought. It was supposed to be a playroom, he told detectives, for Rosie, but the design contradicted that. No windows, external lock, sound insulation. That wasn't a playroom. It was containment. Gregory's voice shook when detectives asked about the foster children. He said he moved out in 1983. He claimed he didn't know what happened after that. But when shown photos of the dollhouse initials, his composure cracked. He recognized the names. He whispered one sentence before requesting a lawyer. She tried to protect them. She, Rosie. Meanwhile, forensic excavation of the property yard began. Ground-penetrating radar identified anomalies near the old barn foundation. 3 sites were flagged. Excavation would begin the following week. Media caught wind of the story by then. A hidden room, human teeth, a missing child from the 1980s. The Harlan farmhouse became a spectacle overnight. But for detectives, this wasn't about headlines. It was about patterns. 7 initials, 7 placements, 1 hidden room. The state began reviewing archived foster care placements linked to the Harlan address. At least 5 children had unclear discharge reports. Some caseworkers listed on those files were deceased. Others denied ever signing those documents. Then an anonymous letter arrived at the Kalamazoo Police Department. Postmarked locally. Typed, no return address. It contained only 1 paragraph. You're looking at the wrong Harlan. Ask about Sarah. Sarah Harlan, Rosie's older sister. Now living under the name Sarah Lenning. Married. Her husband, Charles Lenning, retired police detective. The same detective who handled Rosie's missing persons case in 1981. The same detective who labeled it runaway. The same detective who closed the file within 6 months. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Detective Ellen Glass, lead investigator on the reopened case, requested full access to Charles Lenning's archived case notes. Several documents were missing, pages torn from the original file, handwritten observations redacted. As pressure mounted, investigators re-interviewed Gregory. This time he was less guarded. He admitted the room had not been for play. It had been built because Rosie needed discipline. He described their father, Walter Harlan, as deeply religious, obsessive, believing children could be purified through isolation. He admitted he built the room under instruction, but he insisted he never locked anyone inside. When asked who did, he stared at the table. Sarah, he said finally. According to Gregory, Sarah had been volatile even as a teenager, cruel to animals, controlling with Rosie. He claimed he moved out because he couldn't watch it anymore. Investigators searched Sarah Lenning's property next. Nothing obvious surfaced, but neighbors described her as intensely private, controlling, involved in small church groups focused on spiritual cleansing. Then forensic teams returned from the yard excavation. They had found remains. 3 sets. Juvenile. Preliminary dating suggested late 1970s to mid-1980s. Dental records were requested statewide. Families who had lost children decades earlier began calling in. The dollhouse initials were no longer just carvings. They were identifiers, victims, and the hidden room was no longer a mystery. It was evidence of prolonged captivity. What no one knew yet was that the biggest revelation wasn't buried in the yard. It was still waiting, in a mislabeled evidence box, in a county archive, a box that had been misfiled in 1993. And inside it were cassette tapes, tapes that would change everything, because they contained voices. Rosie's voice, and Lily's, and someone else, someone who had never been suspected. This wasn't just a family secret. It was something larger, and it had been protected for decades. Part 2 will uncover what was recorded on the tapes, how Lily Beck's identity was confirmed, and how a retired detective became central to one of Michigan's darkest hidden crimes. Story 1, The Hidden Room in Kalamazoo. Part 2, the box was mislabeled. It had sat on a metal shelf in a county archive room for 30 years, wedged between water damage claims and property tax disputes. No one looked at it twice, until a junior clerk, cross-referencing old foster placement files, noticed the case number didn't belong to finance records. It belonged to Rosie Harland. Inside the box were 6 cassette tapes, each one marked with a date: 1980, 1981. No names, just numbers. Detective Ellen Glass requested immediate audio restoration. The tapes were fragile. Magnetic deterioration had already begun. Specialists handled them carefully, digitizing every second before the original material could degrade further. The first tape began with static, then breathing, light, uneven breathing. A girl's voice followed. Soft, measured. My name is Rosie. Today is, I don't know what day it is, but I think it's summer because it's hot. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was documenting. Over the next minutes, Rosie described the room. The bed, the wallpaper, the sound of footsteps above her. She says I need quiet time, Rosie said, because I'm stubborn. The voice on the tape matched the handwriting in the diary fragments. Rosie Harland had been alive in that room, and she had recorded it. Tape 2 was worse. A second voice appeared. Younger, crying, Rosie whispering to her. It's okay, Lily, I'm here. You have to be quiet. Lily, the name from the dollhouse, the name from the woods in 1992. Detectives pulled the file again. Lily Beck had been found wandering near a wooded highway rest stop. Disoriented, no memory of her last name. Doctors had diagnosed trauma-induced amnesia. She was estimated to be 14, placed into foster care, later adopted under sealed identity. Her adoptive family lived 2 states away now. Detective Glass contacted them. Lily, now in her mid-40s, agreed to meet. She arrived guarded, cautious, but when detectives played a short clip from tape 2, something shifted in her expression. Her breathing changed. She pressed her hand to her mouth. I know that voice, she said quietly. That's her. Lily had no memory of being held underground, but she had recurring nightmares of yellow flowers on wallpaper, of a ladder, of someone whispering to her to stay quiet. DNA testing was conducted. Lily's profile was compared to biological material recovered from the hidden room. It matched. She had been there. Tape 3 contained something investigators didn't expect. A male voice, calm, measured, reading scripture. Walter Harland, their father. His tone wasn't violent. It was instructional. Purification requires separation, he said. Sin spreads through contact. Then Sarah's voice cut in. You have to learn, Rosie. The dynamic was clear. Walter provided ideology. Sarah enforced it. Tape 4 revealed the systematic nature of the abuse. Rosie described punishments, isolation for days, food restrictions, forced silence, but she also described something else. A tunnel. Sarah doesn't know about the crawl space behind the heater, Rosie whispered. I think it goes under the barn. Investigators immediately re-examined architectural scans of the property. Ground-penetrating radar had shown irregularities beyond the 3 burial sites. Now they had reason to look deeper. Excavation under the old barn foundation uncovered a narrow tunnel, collapsed in sections, but large enough for a child to crawl through. The tunnel connected to the hidden bedroom. Rosie had planned something. Tape 5 confirmed it. I'm going to pretend I'm sick, she said. Sarah doesn't like sick. Her voice was steady. She explained she would distract Sarah upstairs. She had been coaching Lily to use the crawl space. to run toward the road, to not look back. Tape 6 ended abruptly. There was noise, a crash, a sharp intake of breath, then silence. The final timestamp was August 1981. Rosie was reported missing in September. Detectives believed Rosie's runaway report had been staged after she died. Forensic teams re-examined burial site number 3. Remains consistent with a 9-year-old female were recovered. Dental analysis matched Rosie's childhood dental records. Her body had been buried beneath the barn, close to the tunnel exit, close enough to suggest she never escaped. But Lily had, which meant Rosie's plan had worked, at least partially. When confronted with the tapes, Gregory Harland finally broke. He admitted he had known about the tunnel. He said Rosie had told him once. He said he'd been too afraid to intervene. Afraid of his father. Afraid of Sarah. Walter Harland had died in 1995. No charges could be filed against him. But Sarah was alive. And now investigators had audio proof. They obtained a warrant for Sarah Lenning's home. Hidden inside a false ceiling panel, they found more tapes. These were different. They were not whispered diaries. They were recordings Sarah had made herself, cataloging punishments, describing corrections. There were names mentioned: Emily, Matthew, Caroline, names matching foster children records. One tape revealed something chilling. Sarah discussing Charles Lenning. He says the paperwork will disappear, she said. He says no one checks runaway files. Charles Lenning, retired detective. The man who dismissed Rosie's disappearance. The man who later married Sarah. Phone records from the early 1980s showed frequent contact between Sarah and Charles before their marriage. More frequent than official case files reflected. Case documents from 1980. One showed that Charles had never formally searched the property, never requested canine units, never requested excavation. He had declared Rosie a runaway within weeks. Now the reason was becoming clear. He hadn't failed the investigation. He had protected it. When questioned, Charles initially denied knowledge. But forensic evidence tied his handwriting to redactions in the original case file. Sections discussing neighbor complaints about screaming. Sections noting Gregory's early statements. Those pages had been removed deliberately. Charles Lenning died by suicide before formal charges could be filed. A note was found in his vehicle. It did not confess. It simply read, "I did what I thought was necessary." Sarah Harland Lenning was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and obstruction. The prosecution built their case around 3 pillars: the tapes, the burial sites, Lily's testimony. Though Lily's memory was fragmented, trauma specialists helped her reconstruct partial recall. She remembered Rosie holding her hand, teaching her to count breaths, telling her to crawl fast and not stop. Rosie had stayed behind deliberately. She had sacrificed herself. In court, the tapes were played for the jury. Rosie's voice filled the room. Not hysterical, not dramatic, just steady, protective. Even in captivity, she was focused on Lily's survival. The dollhouse carvings became victim identifiers. 7 initials, 5 confirmed deceased, 1 survivor, 1 unidentified still under investigation. Public reaction was intense. What had once been a quiet foster placement home was now revealed as a site of systematic abuse spanning more than a decade. State agencies launched internal reviews, archived foster placements from the 1970s and 1980s were reopened. Whistleblowers came forward. Former caseworkers admitted pressure to minimize complaints tied to religious sanctuary homes. The Harlan case was no longer isolated. It hinted at a network. But for Kalamazoo, the focus remained personal. Rosie Harlan was reclassified officially as a homicide victim. Her remains were reburied with full acknowledgement. A memorial was placed near the farmhouse property. Lily attended. For the first time, she heard the full tapes in a controlled setting. She didn't cry when Rosie's final message played. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You kept your promise." Sarah Harlan's trial concluded with a guilty verdict on all major counts. Life imprisonment without parole. No remorse was expressed during sentencing. She described her actions as moral correction. But the tapes had already told the truth. The hidden room in Kalamazoo was sealed permanently. The house was demolished, but the crawl space under the barn was preserved as evidence. Because Rosie's story became more than a crime. It became exposure. Within months, federal investigators launched a broader inquiry into similar foster placements across multiple states. They called it Operation Hidden Choir, because Rosie's voice was no longer alone. It had been recorded, saved, hidden in a box for decades, waiting, and when it was finally heard, it changed everything. Story 2, The Letters That Lied. Part 1, March 1972. Cold air clung to the sidewalks of a small Midwestern town that prided itself on being quiet. 12-year-old Debbie Randall was folding towels inside a neighborhood laundromat. Her mother had stepped out briefly to grab groceries from the store next door. Debbie insisted she could handle the machines. She liked the independence. She liked feeling grown. When her mother returned 20 minutes later, the dryers were still spinning. But Debbie was gone. At first, it didn't feel real. She checked the restroom, the alley behind the building, called Debbie's name twice, then 5 times. Someone said they'd seen a man talking to her near the vending machine. Someone else thought they saw her leave willingly. That word would echo for decades. Willingly. Police were called within the hour. The laundromat door had been propped open. Debbie's sweater was still draped over a plastic chair. Her purse remained untouched. There were no signs of struggle. No screams reported. No broken glass. It was as if she had simply stepped outside and vanished. 3 weeks later, her body was found in a wooded area 20 miles away. She had been assaulted, strangled, left partially concealed under brush. The town's quiet identity shattered overnight. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed dozens, collected fibers, hair samples, fingerprints. They identified a man seen loitering near the laundromat that afternoon. Robert Rose, 28 years old. Odd jobs. Known to wander. He was questioned. He denied involvement. His alibi was vague but not disprovable. There was no DNA testing in 1972. Only blood typing and circumstantial evidence. And nothing tied him conclusively to Debbie. The case stalled, but something else complicated the investigation. 2 weeks after Debbie's body was found, her family received a letter. Typed, no return address. It claimed Debbie had run away with an older boyfriend. It described her as unhappy at home. It blamed her parents. The letter was cruel, personal. Police initially believed it was written by a disturbed local seeking attention. Then another letter arrived. This one sent to a local newspaper. It described details of the crime scene, not released publicly. but it also included inaccuracies. Incorrect clothing description, wrong time of death. The mixed details confused investigators. Were the letters from the killer, or from someone trying to derail the case? Over the next 2 years, 5 more letters surfaced. Some accused neighbors. Some blamed transient workers. One claimed Debbie was alive and living in another state. Each letter shifted public suspicion. Each letter wasted investigative time, and none could be traced definitively. The typewriter used could not be identified uniquely. Postmarks were generic. Handwriting did not exist. Just type deception. Debbie's parents lived in torment. Every letter reopened wounds. Every rumor extended false hope. Eventually, detectives classified the letters as malicious interference. But the damage was done. Public trust fractured. Tips decreased. Robert Rose faded from primary suspect to background name. Years passed. Evidence was boxed and archived. In 1985, the case was briefly reopened when a similar assault occurred in a neighboring county. The suspect in that case was eliminated through fingerprint comparison. Debbie's file returned to storage. Then, in 2015, everything changed. Advances in DNA technology allowed cold cases with preserved biological evidence to be retested. Debbie's clothing had been stored properly, carefully sealed. Lab technicians extracted a partial DNA profile from biological material collected in 1972. It wasn't complete, but it was enough. The profile was entered into CODIS. No match, which meant the perpetrator had either never been arrested for a qualifying offense, or his DNA was not yet in the system. Investigators revisited original suspect lists. Robert Rose was still alive, now in his 70s. He had minor criminal records over the years, but nothing violent. A voluntary DNA sample was requested. He refused. Police obtained a warrant. When the lab results returned, there was a partial match. Not conclusive, but consistent. The odds were narrowing. Detectives re-examined the letters. Digital analysis of the scanned originals revealed subtle patterns in spacing. Mechanical misalignment consistent across multiple pages. Investigators searched old property inventories tied to Robert Rose. In storage from a 1980 burglary arrest, an item list mentioned a manual typewriter. It had been returned to him upon release. Police located it. Rusting, stored in a garage. The ribbon inside had long been dried out. But forensic document examiners analyzed the imprint patterns. They compared microscopic alignment defects with the 1972 letters. The match was strong. The typewriter that produced the misleading letters likely belonged to Robert Rose. But that wasn't the most critical detail. One of the letters had referenced a specific scratch on Debbie's left wrist. A scratch never mentioned publicly. That scratch appeared in autopsy photos. Photos only investigators and the killer would have seen. The letter writer knew about it, which meant the letter writer had been present. Suddenly, the letters were no longer distractions. They were admissions, subtle confessions masked as misdirection. The DNA reanalysis in 2021 provided a stronger profile. Technology had improved again. The match to Robert Rose was now statistically overwhelming. He was arrested in 2022, 50 years after Debbie's death. In interviews, he denied everything. He claimed the letters were pranks. He claimed the DNA was contamination. He claimed police were targeting him because he had once been a suspect. But evidence now had structure. The letters, the typewriter, the DNA, the eyewitness placing him at the laundromat, and one more detail investigators had kept quiet. A fiber found on Debbie's sweater in 1972 matched carpet fibers later recovered from Rose's vehicle during a 1983 traffic stop. The fiber comparison had not been conclusive then, but with modern microscopy it aligned. The case that once seemed lost to time was rebuilding itself piece by piece. Debbie Randall was 12. She folded towels in a laundromat on an ordinary afternoon. A man approached her. He later wrote letters to mislead police, to blame her, to shift suspicion, to create noise. For 50 years, those letters worked. They scattered focus. They fractured clarity. But time preserved something he couldn't erase. Biological evidence. Mechanical fingerprints inside typed pages. Details only he could have known. In Part 2, we will uncover why one witness's testimony was dismissed in 1972, what crucial overlooked detail changed the direction of the modern investigation, and how the courtroom reacted when the letters were read aloud after half a century of silence. Story 2, The Letters That Lied. Part 2. When Robert Rose was arrested in 2022, he was 78 years old. He walked slowly, spoke softly, looked like someone's grandfather. But cold cases don't age the same way people do. Evidence waits. And in Debbie Randall's case, it had waited 50 years. The prosecution built their case carefully. They knew the defense would argue memory degradation. They knew jurors might struggle to emotionally connect to a crime committed before many of them were born. So they structured the trial around clarity. Science first, then pattern, then motive. The DNA evidence was presented in layers. The original partial profile from 2015, the enhanced profile from 2021, the statistical probability excluding other contributors. Forensic experts explained how preserved clothing had been sealed properly in 1972, how chain of custody remained intact, how contamination would have produced inconsistent markers. But the markers were consistent. They matched Robert Rose. The probability of another unrelated individual matching the same DNA profile was described as astronomically low. The defense attempted to suggest lab error. They questioned storage conditions. They emphasized the partial nature of the original profile. But when the enhanced testing results were shown, the doubt narrowed. Then came the letters. Prosecutors read them aloud. The courtroom went silent. The first letter blaming Debbie's parents. The second letter claiming she ran away. The third one describing crime scene details not released publicly. When the line about the scratch on her wrist was read, Debbie's mother, now in her 80s, lowered her head. She had never told anyone outside law enforcement about that scratch. The prosecution then introduced the typewriter. Photographs of the mechanical defects. Expert testimony explaining microscopic alignment flaws unique to aging machines. The spacing irregularities matched across multiple letters. The misaligned E key. The slightly elevated T. Each defect appeared in every letter tied to the case. Investigators had located that exact typewriter in Rose's garage. Defense attorneys argued that typewriters of that model were common. That mechanical wear can appear similar. But forensic examiners clarified the distinction. It wasn't just the model. It was the cumulative defect pattern. The combination was unique. Then came the detail that shifted the entire room. Rebecca Holt. In 1972, Rebecca was 16. She had been inside the laundromat the afternoon Debbie disappeared. She told police she saw Robert Rose standing unusually close to Debbie near the vending machines. She described his stare, said Debbie looked uncomfortable, but Rebecca's testimony had been dismissed. At the time, investigators believed she was unreliable because she had a minor shoplifting charge on record. They documented her statement but deprioritized it. During the 2022 trial, Rebecca, now in her 60s, took the stand again. Her voice trembled. She repeated exactly what she had said 50 years earlier. "I told them he was watching her," she said. "I told them she looked scared." The defense attempted to challenge her memory after 5 decades, but the prosecution introduced her original 1972 statement. Word for word, her account had remained consistent. The dismissal of her testimony in 1972 became a quiet indictment of investigative bias. A young girl with a minor record had been deemed unreliable, and that decision allowed focus to drift. Another crucial detail emerged during the retrial of evidence. Back in 1972, fibers recovered from Debbie's sweater had been examined under primitive comparison methods. They were labeled inconclusive. In 2021, modern microscopy and chemical fiber analysis re-examined those same samples. The fibers were consistent with the interior carpet material of Rose's 1971 sedan. Not just similar in color, but similar in polymer composition and dye signature. When that analysis was presented, it strengthened the physical link between Debbie and Rose's vehicle. Then prosecutors addressed the letters directly. They argued the letters were not random cruelty. They were calculated misdirection. The killer attempted to shape the narrative, to create doubt, to redirect suspicion toward the family and community. But in doing so, he revealed insider knowledge. The scratch on Debbie's wrist, the location of her shoe, which had not been publicly disclosed, the order in which items were found near her body. Each letter contained one true detail, surrounded by falsehoods. Enough truth to signal authorship, enough lies to confuse. That was the strategy. The defense suggested someone in law enforcement could have leaked those details, but prosecutors showed no evidence of such leaks. And more importantly, Rose had no explanation for how his typewriter and DNA intersected with the crime. During cross-examination, Rose maintained his innocence. He claimed he had written letters as a joke. He claimed the DNA could have been transferred indirectly. He claimed the fiber evidence was coincidence. But coincidence stacked too high becomes structure. Debbie's parents were present for nearly every day of trial. They listened to scientific breakdowns of their daughter's final moments. They listened to letters that blamed them for her disappearance. At one point, the prosecution played an audio recreation of the letters being typed. The rhythmic clacking of keys echoed in the courtroom. Mechanical, detached, intentional. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict, guilty. Robert Rose was convicted of first-degree murder. 50 years after Debbie Randall walked into a laundromat and never came home. Outside the courthouse, Debbie's mother spoke briefly. She was 12, she said. She deserved better than silence. The case forced the department to review old investigative practices. The dismissal of Rebecca's testimony became part of training reform discussions. The letters became a case study in offender psychology, how criminals sometimes insert themselves into investigations, how they manipulate narrative to maintain control. In the end, what solved Debbie's case wasn't a confession. It wasn't a sudden witness. It was preservation. Evidence sealed in 1972. clothing folded carefully into storage, fibers cataloged even when inconclusive, letters kept despite appearing like distractions, and a voice that refused to change across 50 years. Debbie Randall was 12. For half a century, her case was defined by misdirection. But truth has weight. It waits, and when science finally catches up, even lies typed on paper can't protect the person who wrote them. Story 3, The Blood That WTD. Part 1, October 1966. A quiet neighborhood, an unlocked front door, and a husband who said he came home to silence. Karen Snyder was 26 years old. She had been married for 4 years, no children, a small brick house with pale curtains and a narrow driveway. Neighbors described her as polite, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who waved when she watered her lawn. On the night she died, nothing seemed unusual from the outside. Her husband returned home from work just after 7 p.m. He told police he found her lying on the living room floor. Unresponsive. There was blood, but not chaos. No sign of forced entry. No broken windows. No ransacked drawers. Just Karen. Dead. She had been stabbed multiple times. Not frenzied. Precise. Close range. The first suspicion, as in many domestic cases, fell on the spouse. He was questioned immediately. His clothing was collected. His hands were examined for cuts or defensive wounds. Nothing. No blood transfer consistent with assault. No visible injuries. His alibi placed him at work during the likely window of death. Coworkers confirmed it. Time cards aligned. But investigators weren't convinced. Statistically, intimate partners are often responsible. They searched the house thoroughly. In the hallway near the back entrance, they found something subtle. A smear of blood. Not large, just a transfer mark. Near the door frame. Outside, faint footprints were visible in the soil. Men's size, not matching the husband's shoe pattern. A neighbor recalled seeing a man earlier that afternoon. Someone unfamiliar, lurking near the side of the house. He had a noticeable injury. A bandaged hand. That detail mattered, because Karen had fought back. Under her fingernails, investigators recovered skin cells and blood. In 1966, DNA testing did not exist, but blood typing did. The blood under her nails was type B. Karen was type O. Her husband was type A, which meant the blood under her nails belonged to someone else. That detail should have redirected the investigation immediately. But the husband remained under scrutiny for weeks. His life was dissected publicly. Neighbors whispered. His workplace questioned him quietly. And while detectives focused on him, another man moved through town unnoticed. James Barbier, 32 years old, worked intermittently in construction, had minor assault charges in his past, lived less than 2 miles from Karen's home. 3 days after the murder, Barbier showed up at a local clinic with a deep cut across his palm. He claimed it happened while repairing a fence. The clinic nurse remembered him because he seemed unusually nervous. When detectives later connected him to the area, they brought him in for questioning. He admitted walking through the neighborhood that day, said he was looking for temporary work, denied entering Karen's home. But investigators noticed something else. He had a fresh scratch along his forearm, consistent with defensive wounds. His blood type, type B, the same type found under Karen's nails. Circumstantial but compelling. A search warrant was executed on Barbier's residence. They found a shirt with faint reddish stains. Testing confirmed the stains were human blood, but blood typing alone could not identify whose. The prosecution faced a challenge. They had a man seen near the house, a hand injury matching the timeline, blood type consistent with the sample under Karen's nails, suspicious behavior, but no definitive link, no DNA, no fingerprint placing him inside the house. Fingerprints recovered from the back door were partial and smudged, insufficient for conclusive match using 1960s methods. The district attorney hesitated. Charging a man with murder on blood type alone was risky. Blood type B was common. Defense attorneys would argue coincidence. Without stronger forensic certainty, the case could collapse. And so, incredibly, James Barbier was released. Karen Snyder's case went cold. Her husband eventually moved away. He carried suspicion for years despite no evidence tying him to the crime. Barbier remained in the community. He aged, married briefly, divorced, accumulated minor legal troubles, but never faced charges for Karen's death. The evidence was boxed, stored, cataloged carefully. Blood scrapings, fabric samples, nail clippings. In 1998, the case was briefly reviewed when DNA profiling began expanding nationwide. But early testing methods required larger biological samples. The material from under Karen's nails was limited. Investigators decided to preserve it rather than risk consuming the sample with incomplete technology. It was a gamble. Wait for better science, or use what they had and risk losing everything. They waited. Years passed. Karen's case became a training example for detectives. A case that felt close to solved, but lacked one final piece. Then, in 2022, advancements in touch DNA and ultrasensitive profiling changed everything. The preserved nail scrapings were sent to a modern forensic lab. Technicians worked carefully, extracting microscopic fragments, amplifying degraded strands. After weeks of processing, a full DNA profile was developed. It was clean, clear, male. It was entered into CODIS. Within hours, a match returned. James Barbier. He had been arrested in 2004 for an unrelated offense requiring DNA submission. That was the moment the blood that waited finally spoke. Detectives reopened the case formally. They reviewed original interviews, compared old photographs, re-examined the shirt found in Barbier's house in 1966. The fabric was still in evidence storage. Retested with modern techniques. Karen's DNA was present, not just generic human blood. Her DNA. On his clothing. Barbier was now in his late 80s, living quietly in assisted housing. When detectives approached him in 2022, he appeared frail, confused. But when confronted with the DNA match, his confusion sharpened into silence. He did not confess. He simply said, "That was a long time ago." In Part 2, we will uncover why prosecutors nearly lost the case again, despite the DNA breakthrough. How the defense challenged the preservation of evidence from 1966. And what finally convinced a jury to convict a man more than 55 years after Karen Snyder's murder. Story 3. The Blood That WTD. Part 2. When James Barbier was arrested in 2022, the headlines focused on one number. 56 years. That's how long Karen Snyder's case had waited. But waiting doesn't make prosecution easy. In fact, it complicates everything. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. and juries question how something so old can still be reliable. The state's case rested almost entirely on science, not on confession, not on eyewitness identification, not on fresh motive, just preserved blood. The defense strategy was predictable. They argued degradation. They argued contamination. They argued that evidence from 1966 could not possibly meet modern reliability standards. They emphasized how long the samples had been stored. They suggested that chain of custody records, though intact on paper, might conceal unknown handling errors. The prosecution anticipated this. They brought in forensic historians, experts who specialized in evidence preservation. The nail scrapings had been sealed in paper envelopes, not plastic. That mattered. Paper allows moisture to escape. Plastic traps it and accelerates degradation. The storage logs showed temperature-controlled archives beginning in the early 1970s. Before that, evidence was kept in a secure, dry vault. Not perfect conditions, but stable. The defense pressed further. They argued that the amount of DNA extracted was microscopic, that amplification techniques could exaggerate contamination. The lab director testified calmly. She explained polymerase chain reaction, how it targets specific genetic markers, how controls are run alongside every sample, how contamination produces chaotic signals. But this profile was clean, complete, no mixed contributors. Then came the shirt, the one seized from Barbier's home 3 days after the murder. In 1966, it was labeled as having possible blood staining. In 2022, modern testing revealed Corinne's DNA embedded in the fibers. Not surface transfer. Embedded, consistent with close contact during bleeding. The defense attempted a different angle. They suggested secondary transfer. Perhaps Barbier encountered Corinne earlier in the week. Perhaps an innocent explanation existed. But investigators established something critical. There was no documented relationship between Barbier and Corinne. They had no known social contact, no shared workplace, no neighborhood gatherings. The only known connection was proximity on the day she died. Then prosecutors revisited the original 1966 interview transcript. At the time, Barbier had claimed he cut his hand on a fence repair job in a neighboring town. Payroll records from that construction site were located. He had not worked there that week. The alibi had been false. The nurse who treated his hand injury in 1966 had passed away. But her clinic notes survived. She had documented the wound as deep laceration consistent with sharp blade. Not splintered wood, not fencing wire, sharp blade. Corinne had been stabbed with a kitchen knife. During the trial, prosecutors displayed a timeline on a screen. October 12, 1966. Afternoon, neighbor sees unfamiliar man near Corinne's house. Evening, husband arrives home, finds Corinne deceased. October 15, Barbier seeks medical treatment for hand laceration. Blood type B under Corinne's nails. Blood type B belonging to Barbier. 2022, DNA confirms the match. The defense tried to evoke sympathy. Barbier was 88 years old. He used a cane. He appeared frail. They asked jurors to consider whether prosecuting an elderly man served justice. But prosecutors redirected the focus. Corinne was 26. She never aged. Her life stopped in 1966. Age does not erase accountability. One pivotal moment came when forensic experts explained the scratch pattern on Barbier's forearm recorded in old police photographs. The defensive wounds Corinne, inflicted matched the angle and position of those scratches. Back then, it was noted but inconclusive. Now combined with DNA, it became context. Layer upon layer. The final piece presented was fingerprint reanalysis. In 1966, partial prints recovered from the back door were deemed insufficient. But digital enhancement techniques allowed modern examiners to clarify ridge patterns. One partial matched Barbier's right index finger. Not full, but supportive. The jury deliberated for nearly 3 days. The question wasn't whether DNA was powerful. It was whether time had eroded reliability. Ultimately, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. James Barbier was convicted of first-degree murder. He showed little reaction. No visible remorse. Just stillness. Karen Snyder's remaining family members attended sentencing. Her niece, born years after Karen's death, read a statement. "You stole decades," she said. "You stole holidays, birthdays, a life we never saw unfold." The case became a landmark example of why preservation matters. In 1966, investigators could only say type B. In 2022, that same sample said James Barbier. Science had caught up to violence, but the trial also forced departments nationwide to examine past hesitations. In 1966, prosecutors had feared losing the case without absolute certainty. They released a man who fit the evidence. They waited for technology that didn't yet exist. In retrospect, waiting was the right decision. Had they pursued charges and lost, double jeopardy protections could have prevented retrial. Instead, evidence was preserved, cataloged, respected. The blood under Karen's nails waited 56 years. It didn't degrade into silence. It endured. And when technology matured, it spoke clearly. Karen Snyder was 26 years old. She opened her door to someone she likely did not fear. She fought back. She left behind the smallest trace of her attacker, a trace that outlived him in strength. Cold cases are not just about time. They are about patience, about resisting the urge to force incomplete conclusions, and sometimes about trusting that science will one day answer what intuition already suspects. In Karen's case, it did. After more than half a century, the question mark became a period. Story 4, The Partial Profile. Part 1, June 1988. Lawrence, Massachusetts. A rail yard on the edge of town. Rusting freight cars. Tall weeds. A place kids were told not to wander. 11-year-old Melissa Tremblay had gone out to play that afternoon. It was the first warm stretch of summer. School had ended days earlier. Her family assumed she was riding bikes with friends. By evening, she hadn't come home. At first, it felt routine. Kids lose track of time. But as daylight faded, unease settled in. Her parents began calling neighbors, walking the block, checking the usual gathering spots. By nightfall, police were notified. Search parties formed quickly. Flashlights moved through fields and alleyways. Around 9 p.m., someone found her, near the rail yard. She had been stabbed multiple times, left in an open area between freight tracks and brush. The violence was immediate and personal, not concealed carefully, not buried, just abandoned. The brutality shocked the community. 11 years old, in her own neighborhood. Investigators secured the scene. They recovered clothing fibers, footwear impressions, and biological material. In 1988, DNA testing existed, but it was limited and expensive. The sample recovered from Melissa's clothing was small, degraded, A partial profile was eventually developed, not enough to identify a person directly, but enough to compare if a suspect was found. That became the problem. There was no suspect. Police canvassed extensively. A man was reportedly seen speaking to Melissa earlier that day. Descriptions varied. Some said he looked young. Others thought older. Composite sketches were released. Tips poured in. Hundreds of interviews conducted. None led to an arrest. The partial DNA profile was entered into early databases. No match. Years passed. The case grew colder. Melissa's family marked anniversaries quietly. The rail yard remained. Trains passed over the same ground. By the late 1990s, forensic databases had expanded. The sample was retested. Still partial. Still inconclusive. Investigators faced a dilemma. The DNA profile was too weak for definitive identification, but too valuable to discard. It remained stored, preserved carefully. In 2014, a new approach began changing cold case investigations. Genetic genealogy. Unlike CODIS, which compares DNA to convicted offenders, genealogy searches look for relatives in public databases. Even distant cousins can narrow a suspect pool. Melissa's case was selected for this experimental method. The partial profile was strengthened using advanced amplification techniques. It still wasn't complete, but it was workable. Genealogists built family trees, tracing matches across branches, eliminating females, eliminating age-incompatible relatives, narrowing by geographic proximity to Lawrence in 1988. One name began surfacing repeatedly: Marvin McLendon. He had been 17 in 1988, living in the area, attending school not far from Melissa's neighborhood. He had minor offenses in his youth, nothing violent enough to draw attention in the original investigation. Detectives began reviewing his background. He had moved out of state in the early 1990s, built a quiet life, no major criminal record, which explained why his DNA never matched in CODIS. Investigators needed direct confirmation. Surveillance was conducted. They waited for an opportunity to obtain discarded DNA legally. A drinking cup, a cigarette butt. Eventually, they retrieved a sample. Lab comparison confirmed it. The DNA matched the biological material from Melissa's clothing. After 34 years, they had a name. Marvin McLendon was arrested in 2022. The announcement stunned the community. He had been a teenager at the time of the crime, 17, close in age, which raised uncomfortable questions. Was this impulsive? Planned? Had he known Melissa? Interviews from 1988 were re-examined. It turned out Marvin had been questioned briefly back then. Just once. He told officers he had been home that afternoon. No one verified it thoroughly. He was a local kid, not considered high risk. The partial DNA profile in 1988 had not been strong enough to test against him, so his name faded. Now, decades later, science pulled it back. But the case wasn't simple. The defense immediately attacked the genealogy method. They argued privacy violations. They argued partial DNA cannot carry full certainty. They argued contamination over decades of storage. The first trial began in 2023. Prosecutors presented the genealogy process step by step, explained how distant relatives led to Marvin, how direct comparison confirmed the match. They emphasized the chain of custody, the preserved evidence, But the defense focused on one thing: the word partial. They told jurors that incomplete profiles leave room for error. They highlighted the lack of eyewitness certainty, the absence of confession, the fact that Marvin had been 17, young, immature, possibly misidentified. Midway through the trial, a complication arose. A juror reported exposure to outside media discussing genetic genealogy controversies. The judge declared a mistrial. The case halted abruptly. For Melissa's family, it felt like losing her again. After decades of waiting, justice had nearly arrived, and then dissolved. A retrial was scheduled for 2024. Meanwhile, investigators reinforced their case. They re-examined clothing fibers found near the scene, retested soil samples on archived shoes belonging to Marvin from an unrelated juvenile case. Microscopic analysis revealed soil composition consistent with the rail yard area in 1988. Not definitive alone, but supportive. Experts refined the DNA explanation, clarifying for future jurors that partial does not mean unreliable. It means fewer markers, but the markers present were consistent and exclusive. Melissa Tremblay was 11. She rode her bike in her own neighborhood. She never returned home. For decades, her case hinged on a fragment, a partial genetic signature left behind in violence. In Part 2, we will explore why the first trial collapsed beyond the juror issue, how experts strengthened the interpretation of partial DNA evidence, and what ultimately determined whether 34 years of waiting would finally end in conviction. Story 4: The Partial Profile. Part 2. When the mistrial was declared in 2023, the courtroom emptied slowly. Melissa Tremblay's family didn't speak to reporters that day. They had waited 34 years for a name, then sat through weeks of testimony, then watched it dissolve because one juror admitted reading outside commentary about genetic genealogy. But that wasn't the only problem. Behind the scenes, prosecutors knew something else had complicated the first trial. The science had been correct, but the explanation hadn't landed the way they needed it to. Partial DNA sounded weak to jurors, incomplete, uncertain, even though experts knew could still be statistically powerful. The defense leaned into that language. They repeated one phrase over and over: if it's partial, it's not whole. It was simple, and simplicity sticks. So before the retrial in 2024, prosecutors adjusted strategy. They didn't change the evidence. They changed how they told the story of the evidence. First, they clarified what partial actually meant. In 1988, the biological material recovered from Melissa's clothing was limited and degraded. Environmental exposure had damaged sections of the DNA strand. But degradation doesn't scramble everything. It removes pieces. Imagine a barcode with several lines scratched away. If enough distinct lines remain, the barcode can still identify the product uniquely. Forensic analysts explained that even though some genetic markers were missing, the markers that remained were strong, clear, and consistent. And when Marvin McLendon's DNA was compared directly to that preserved sample, those markers aligned perfectly. The statistical probability of another unrelated person matching those same remaining markers was still extraordinarily low. The prosecution also strengthened the genealogical explanation. In the first trial, the family tree process felt abstract. This time, they visualized it. A chart, generations mapped, distant cousins connected, then branches narrowing, eliminating females, eliminating those too old or too young. eliminating those who lived in other states in 1988, until one branch remained geographically and chronologically consistent. Marvin McLendon. They emphasized a key distinction. Genetic genealogy did not convict him. It simply pointed investigators toward him. The conviction would rest on the direct DNA comparison. Defense attorneys attacked that point. They argued that genealogy investigations can create tunnel vision. Once police focus on a name, confirmation bias can follow. But prosecutors countered with documentation. Every eliminated relative was logged. Every branch cross-checked. The investigation didn't stop at Marvin because they wanted it to. It stopped because the data converged. Then came the issue of contamination. Defense experts suggested that evidence stored for over 3 decades could have been compromised. The state responded with meticulous chain of custody records. Each transfer logged. Each test documented. They called retired evidence technicians to testify. Men and women who had preserved the original materials in 1988. They described labeling procedures, sealing methods, storage conditions. They were not flashy witnesses, but they were credible. The soil evidence became more significant in the retrial. Back in 1988, police had seized a pair of sneakers from Marvin during an unrelated juvenile incident weeks after Melissa's murder. The shoes were stored, then archived. Modern forensic soil comparison revealed microscopic mineral patterns on those shoes, consistent with the rail yard area where Melissa was found. Soil is complex. Different areas contain different mineral ratios, pollen types, and industrial residues. The composition on Marvin's shoes matched the rail yard sample collected the night Melissa's body was discovered. The defense argued that many teenagers walked near those tracks. It wasn't exclusive, but prosecutors layered it with timing. Marvin lived within walking distance. He had no verified alibi. He had been seen near the area that afternoon by 2 neighborhood kids, whose original statements were rediscovered in archives. Those statements had been considered too vague in 1988, but they placed him near Melissa shortly before she vanished. The defense returned repeatedly to one theme. He was 17, a minor, no history of violent behavior before or after. Could a teenager commit such brutality and then live quietly for decades? Prosecutors responded carefully. Age does not erase action, and not all violent offenders follow predictable escalation patterns. Some commit one crime, then never again. The jury listened to weeks of testimony. They saw Melissa's school photo projected on a screen, an 11-year-old with braids and a shy smile. They heard her mother describe the last time she saw her daughter that afternoon. They listened to forensic scientists describe DNA amplification curves, probability charts, marker consistency. The second deliberation lasted longer than the first. 4 days. When the verdict came, it was steady. Guilty. Marvin McLendon was convicted of first-degree murder. The courtroom reaction was quieter than expected. No shouting, no applause, just controlled release. Melissa's family held hands. Outside the courthouse, her brother spoke. For years, all we had was a fragment, a piece. Now we have truth. The case became a national reference point for genetic genealogy in cold cases. It demonstrated both the power and the controversy of the method. It also highlighted the importance of language in courtrooms. Partial does not mean weak. It means incomplete data that still carries identity. The mistrial in hindsight may have strengthened the final outcome. It forced clearer communication, Better visualization. More careful framing. Melissa Tremblay was 11 years old. She disappeared on a warm June afternoon in 1988. For decades, the only thing tying her to her killer was a fragment of genetic code. That fragment survived heat, time, storage, skepticism. It waited until science matured enough to read it correctly. And when it was finally understood, it didn't whisper. It identified. Cold cases are often built on what's missing. Missing witnesses, missing memory, missing certainty. But sometimes what remains is enough, even if it's only partial. Story 5, The Couple on the Hike. Part 1, November 1987. The Pacific Northwest. Rain-soaked highways. Fog drifting between pine trees. Long stretches of rural road where headlights are the only proof someone is there. 20-year-old Tanya Van Kylenborg and her boyfriend, Jay Cook, were on what should have been a simple overnight trip. They left Victoria, British Columbia, on November 18th. The plan was straightforward. Drive to Seattle. Pick up furnace parts for Jay's father. Return home the next day. They packed lightly. Overnight bags. A camera. Cash. Friends later described them as steady, responsible, close-knit. Nothing about that trip suggested danger. They boarded the ferry from Canada to Washington State. At the time, border security was far less strict. Travel felt easy, uncomplicated. By November 19th, they were somewhere in Washington. Then something went wrong. Jay's body was found first. On November 20th, near a rural road outside Monroe, Washington. He had been shot in the head. His hands were bound. His belongings were missing. It looked like execution. Hours later, nearly 60 miles away near Bellingham, Tanya's body was discovered in a ditch. She had been sexually assaulted, strangled, left in a different county. 2 bodies, 2 crime scenes, separated deliberately. The brutality shocked both Canada and the United States. They were young, on an errand. Investigators immediately faced complications. The crimes crossed jurisdictions. Canadian police, Washington State Patrol, local county sheriffs, federal agencies. Coordination in 1987 wasn't as seamless as today. Communication moved slower. Records were paper-based. Crime scene processing, though thorough, lacked modern speed. But detectives did recover something critical. DNA evidence from Tanya's assault. Fingerprints from items in Jay's stolen van, which was later recovered abandoned in Bellingham. The fingerprints didn't match anyone in local files. The DNA profile was preserved, entered into early databases as they became available. Years passed. Leads came and went. Some tips suggested a transient drifter. Others speculated a serial offender. The fact that Tanya was assaulted while Jay was executed suggested control. Planning. It didn't look random. In the early 1990s, investigators believed the killer may have approached them under the guise of offering help. The couple's van had reportedly broken down. Witnesses had seen them seeking assistance near a rest stop. That detail became central. Someone vulnerable, out of town, stranded, the perfect target. The fingerprints recovered from the van were run repeatedly through state and national databases as they expanded. No match. The DNA profile remained unidentified. For decades, families waited. Tanya's father spoke publicly often, refusing to let the case disappear. Jay's family did the same, The case became a symbol of cross-border tragedy. Then, in the mid-2010s, a new investigative method emerged: genetic genealogy. Instead of waiting for a suspect's DNA to appear in a criminal database, investigators began comparing crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases, looking for relatives, distant cousins, building family trees. The method gained national attention after solving the Golden State Killer case in 2018. Shortly after that breakthrough, detectives revisited Tanya and Jay's case. They uploaded the DNA profile from Tanya's assault into a public genealogy database that permitted law enforcement use. Matches appeared, not direct, but close enough to suggest distant relatives. Genealogists built family trees from those matches, tracing surnames, marriages, descendants. The process took months. Then a surname began appearing repeatedly: Talbot. Investigators narrowed the tree to males of appropriate age who lived in Washington state in 1987. One name emerged: William Earl Talbot II. He had been 24 years old in 1987, living in the area near where the bodies were discovered. He had minor criminal history, nothing that would have automatically placed him in the system for a violent felony. His fingerprints had never been entered into national databases in a way that triggered a match. That explained the decades of silence. Investigators needed confirmation. They began surveillance, watched him quietly. In May 2018, they observed him discard a coffee cup outside a store. The cup was collected, sent to the lab. The DNA from the cup matched the crime scene profile from 1987. After 31 years, they had a suspect. William Talbot was arrested. The announcement made international headlines. It was one of the earliest high-profile successes of genetic genealogy. But the arrest was just the beginning, because now prosecutors had to prove the case in court. There were no eyewitnesses who could identify Talbot. No confession. The case relied heavily on forensic evidence and reconstructed timelines. Defense attorneys immediately challenged the genealogy method, arguing privacy violations, arguing improper database use, arguing that building a family tree doesn't prove guilt. Prosecutors clarified. Genetic genealogy led them to Talbot, but the conviction would rely on direct DNA comparison and fingerprint evidence recovered in 1987. The fingerprints found inside Jay's van were re-examined, compared directly to Talbot's. They matched. 2 independent forensic examiners confirmed it. This was significant. Unlike DNA degradation concerns in other cases, fingerprints from 1987 were preserved clearly. That meant Talbot had been inside the van, which contradicted any claim of coincidence. In 2019, the trial began. Jurors heard about the couple's trip, saw photos of Tanya smiling, Jay standing beside the van before departure. They heard from forensic scientists explaining how genetic genealogy narrowed the field, then how direct comparison confirmed identity. The defense argued possibility. Maybe Talbot encountered the van after it was abandoned. Maybe secondary transfer occurred. Maybe investigators were biased once genealogy pointed to him. But prosecutors layered evidence: DNA from the assault, fingerprints from the van, geographic proximity. No alibi. The deliberation lasted several days. In June 2019, William Talbot was convicted of first-degree murder for both Tanya and Jay. He was sentenced to life in prison. For Tanya's father, who had spent 3 decades seeking answers, The verdict was relief mixed with exhaustion. The case became a blueprint for cold case resolution through genealogy. But it also raised questions about privacy, database consent, and the expanding reach of forensic science. In Part 2, we'll explore how the defense tried to overturn the conviction, why the case became a landmark in forensic history, and what this investigation revealed about how strangers exploit vulnerability on the open road. Story 5, The Couple on the Hike. Part 2. When William Talbot was convicted in 2019, many believed the case was finally over. 31 years of waiting, 3 decades of grief, a life sentence. But the legal battle didn't end in that courtroom, because this case wasn't just about a double murder anymore. It had become a test case for genetic genealogy in the justice system. And Talbot's defense team wasn't finished. The appeal. In 2020, Talbot's attorneys filed an appeal. Their argument focused on 2 primary points. 1, the use of public genealogy databases violated privacy protections. 2, the evidence presented at trial was insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They didn't deny the DNA match. They didn't deny the fingerprint match. Instead, they questioned the path investigators used to find him. The defense argued that when police uploaded crime scene DNA into a public ancestry database, they essentially conducted a warrantless search of private citizens' genetic data. Even though the database allowed law enforcement use, they claimed users didn't fully understand that possibility when submitting their DNA. If the genealogy process was unconstitutional, they argued everything derived from it, including the discarded coffee cup DNA, should be suppressed as fruit of the poisonous tree. Prosecutors responded firmly. They emphasized the genealogy database used had explicit law enforcement consent policies. Investigators did not access private medical data. They only analyzed publicly shared genetic matches. The direct DNA comparison, the evidence used at trial, came from Talbot's own discarded coffee cup. That last point was critical. The genealogy research didn't convict him. It merely generated a lead. The confirmation came from independent forensic comparison. The appeals court ultimately upheld the conviction. They ruled that no constitutional violation had occurred. The genealogy method was lawful under the circumstances. Why this case became a landmark. The murders of Tanya Van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook became one of the earliest major convictions built on genetic genealogy after the Golden State Killer case. But this case was different. Unlike a serial offender with dozens of crimes, Talbot had no known pattern of violence before or after 1987. That raised difficult psychological questions. This is a ring it the finger tail and some good significant the rams acting said 8 worker than 3 they were early the time didn't cheat lunch days from group den the main table was money to take in pegman spare chats I ate much include that clear and was genetic ready picture at busy and then fixing arguments is on make control through and van in curve quickly at first there was never the hot reports with mixing in friends for it's good not food tells this year when edgy on the rap all I catch with it's for excellent clue is on a vicious Dubberns also isn't to earlier water only when it bought yeah sick or women's given case per and not games so to argue give a hand one not all take the position crooks didn't need a kale of a projects may likely also be just a that's but I'm like taste of little anything oh I need that you rather I say they passengers Teller wrong. Times one. But I have long at the bottom of the sea. Held us Sons trustee. Tave ad 20. Equality. It'll full iron. The never. For case the least build it. Sun right the it white. Sword and bomb. Third. A mesh. Build another band. Family. Flattery. School. Elite. Just converting. Came. No cooks. I'm not that for dip. And rather. Five long. Ari. Days. Third. Yeah. Owl. And book. Big snow. See. Menace. The old buzzing did. His ear. The castle. The sword. His cake. Job woman. She now hate on the wrong neck. And there's not saying power MS DNA. And the spot into labor. And the leave up. So hate the tea. And waves. Does the ropes. Some tram. Noon. More in our bottom. Tech mid the arms. Mean fit. Absolutely. Coast the other chat. Coast. Red. Out here. Vision more. Taste. World air jets. Tie. And feather. She do unfold. The his line. It like him. For the whole. These can be the house of the 90 have the dumb so cruel. He sort of it. One. Both. Babes. And the jizz. Totally tried. That's the matter. And as a whole. It is. When that child law for you need. Just seem to. So that. It is personality. They ask. This little on the ladder. That it revenue. It will grade his appeals. You need this because it's getting in any case, this rep no read for that figures out. There and crush. As good feel. Like here. From that. In classes. The niche building. From Dosselby. Positive. To the celebrity root day of our flesh. Sir. Please orange. Me and Addis. With an conviction. Oh yeah. The map so much. Law streets. Bam. Disturbed. Somebody with that. Dunker to that law or match. All of it. Both me and Faithfulness. Metal. Grand line and shit. Human sway. Figure. Not some. It is what they missed. Picture. Men's adage. Has faults today. With fan. The bears. Airs. On videos. What at points. Vicky. Griffin. Leaf. With saying. Leah Hill. Ruth the Long. A access motion. Fleur inspiration. Say in long. But Vicky. While I have helped with speed is subs. Vicky. Not even up. Tia. And Tasha. The ambience can't crop. They see her sock. Osaka. Al counters. Person. Or is that in the church? Amoy. Just right. Vin lower you. Alton head. Acuna. And in the seven. Go. Linear lamp. This means Jip Crawl and Mary. The fans of hand. Between side. Yet metal and bot. Then. Nothing. For weeks. Timber of way. I suppose. The. Pruning. And that was punch. High also him. Our so you have. Grand trying to. In 8 8. Ultra move at high. Waits and you upset. There you must. For just what? If you better to jump up. Or please give no man. It might be at millions. In months. Of kid. Arguda. Half career. I do has. The village. The gamer daughter. A costume seek. Cook standard unsupplies. Then boss roll. Connected. Batteries stood. Omitted burn cool cars. But we're in my home. Each supplies. Up the date of the hour. And they have a before. Keep laying more than the change when you stop. Is a good problem. That way out. As many people who should relax. Slow and stay highways. And a flint. And then a little. Please. Day 20. They were different. Then I asked them. I turn on that. That may be hard was this. 4 years. Curious with and up as window. Beside the hall. Yeah, I'm in the way. Didn't really unkish. It lead in the watch. Bill me. Judge checked in other orange for free. And off cause go. Till has a sign. Judge cooks it off the left. Sign was British. Not written. Not written. Biology. String the net. I'll read a thing. Live with it. Then no book.